All right. So, welcome everyone that is here right now. Join us today live, and thank you to everyone who's watching this after. It's been posted on YouTube. We're really excited to be a little over a week into the Shade Secret Labs Perpetual Swap Exchange Hackathon. My name is Red Eyed Bear, and today I'm going to be talking about some of the mathematical and economic modeling that is required for perpetual swap exchanges. And just want to point out that this is not a completely comprehensive overview of all mathematical modeling that's required, but we are going to cover most of the major topics that are included in mathematical modeling. So we're going to be talking about three primary topics today, and I'll briefly be touching on one additional topic at the end. So the three primary topics we're going to talk about today are assumptions made for economic models. We're going to talk about some parameter definitions. We'll discuss fees and fee structures and how they change relative to market and user input. And during that fee discussion, we'll talk about the three main types of fees that are important to maintaining delta neutrality or encouraging delta neutrality for net open interest. And we'll briefly touch on risk reduction through modeling. So let's first talk about some of the assumptions for modeling economic parameters. So for the economic models for perpetual exchanges, we're going to be focusing on those that utilize liquidity pools as their source of liquidity. There are other predominant models out there, incumbent models such as those that use order books like DYDX or virtual AMMs. As I said, we're going to be focusing on perpetual swap exchanges that utilize liquidity pools as their source of liquidity. So that's an important first assumption. Another assumption is how the protocol is going to maintain internal position tracking. There's two main ways this is done, either via a mark price or like a slipped spot price. I'm not going to go into details about all of their differences, but for context, mark prices that are used by really popular perpetual swap exchanges like GMX are impacted by funding payments, funding rates. Slip spot price, or just commonly referred to as spot prices within perpetual swap exchange, are impacted by delta neutrality fees. So what causes them to change relative to user and market input is slightly different. Another assumption that we're going to make is that we are building a perpetual swap exchange that is considered well-funded. And by well-funded, I mean that traders have the ability to settle at any time, at any spot price, and in any market condition. This guarantees a level of solvency and ability to match liabilities that's critical for long-term sustainability and further composability with other products, such as those within the Shade Protocol suite of applications, which is why we're so interested in this well-funded type of perpetual swap exchange. Effectively, well-fundedness translates to each position a trader opens has locked counter collateral on the other side, basically taking the other side of the trade from liquidity pool. So if you open a long position, effectively liquidity providers are effectively opening up a short position on the other side of that. You'll need to make some assumptions. Again, another assumption we'll have to make is what type of denominated market you're primarily going to be servicing, whether that be crypto denominated market or a stablecoin denominated market. The example would be like, do you want to, are you going to have like Bitcoin USD markets, or are you going to have like Bitcoin ETH markets? So that's kind of the difference, and the calculations and mechanisms used to update these change depending on what type of denominated market you're choosing. And then we'll also be making some assumptions about our fee structures. We assume we want to assess fees for trades, opening, closing positions. We want to assess fees to compensate liquidity providers for the risk they're taking on, which is materialized as a borrow fee. We want to assess or pay out fees to encourage actions that make the protocol more delta neutral overall. And those are these delta neutrality fees that are assessed. And then we also want to encourage payment of fees between longs and shorts to encourage greater delta neutrality as well, and to protect liquidity providers, and that materializes in the form of a funding rate. Um, Additionally, when we're modeling, the mathematics of these different fee structures and how different parameters change relative to market and user inputs, um, we need to understand, yeah, in order to model fee structures and their ability to positively impact risk compensation and delta neutrality, we need to understand how these update in relation to user inputs and markets. And it should be assumed that any constants that are used in this modeling can be tweaked and optimized. We're not going to go through the process of actually optimizing those constants, as it changes based on a bunch of different variables, but we'll show how they can be tweaked. So let's go ahead and define what fees we're going to be modeling for this well-funded perpetual swap exchange that leverages liquidity pools in order to lock collateral as counter trades for collateralized leverage positions that are opened. So we have 4 main fees to define. I know there's only 3 on this slide. The one that's not included are trading fees. The fees that are shown are all dynamic fees. So through these dynamic fees, an unbalanced protocol can shift towards greater delta neutrality. As a result of these dynamic fees, existing positions will slightly change. So trading fees are just assessed for opening, changing positions. You have trading fees that are assessed in the collateral put up by trades to reward liquidity providers for risk. And then there's also trading fees that are assessed in counter collateral that is needed to be locked up for the to guarantee the well-fundedness of the position that was opened on the other side. So there are trading fees assessed for both opening or changing positions, and then there's also a fee assessed for, you can assume there's a fee assessed for changing the counter collateral that needs to be adjusted on the opposite side of this. But as far as dynamic fees go, we have three main dynamic fees. Funding rate, which are fees from owners of the popular side of positions that get paid to the owners of unpopular side positions. So if longs are more predominant than shorts in a particular market, longs will pay shorts. And if the opposite were true, shorts would pay longs. You have a borrow fee, which is a fee paid by traders to liquidity providers for locking up that liquidity. And that fee is collected on an ongoing basis. Borrow trading fees should be credited prorated to owners of LP tokens. Generally, it would likely be best to be sent to a contract for claiming at discretion and paid out on a per block basis versus in epics where it just gets distributed to you. And a portion of this fee stream ideally should be allocated towards the protocol as earned revenue. That being said, it's important to maintain a strong yet not overly strong incentivization for liquidity providers. So a heavy skew for revenue split towards LPs is needed, but the protocol needs to be able to earn revenue as well. And then you have a delta neutrality fee, which is a fee paid when an action moves the protocol away from a delta neutral position, and a fee that is received when an action moves the protocol towards a delta neutral position. And this fee would be paid from a specific address meant to only receive and pay out these fees that are basically assessed to help defend liquidity providers and lower the risk of market melt up or melt down. And it's worth mentioning that caps should be put in place for all of these dynamic fees. The caps are somewhat arbitrarily determined for your funding rate, your borrow fees, your delta neutrality fees, in order to uphold, like in quotes, the spirit of well-fundedness, which we'll cover in greater detail in just a little bit. But yeah, we'll go ahead and briefly cover some of these parameter definitions that will be referenced throughout the rest of this. So we have three main parameter definitions for a particular position with a price of P. You have your notional size of the position. You have the collateral that is put up by the trader on their side of the position, and then there's collateral on the counter side of the position. Any updates to existing positions, involves changing both notional size of position, collateral on both the trader side and the counter side, involves charging trading fees, basically on the difference between the new and old notional size and collateral sizes. And the examples of this is like if you're topping up, if you want to raise your take profit, which effectively means you need to have more counter liquidity, counter side liquidity, or if you want to change the notional size of your position in order to target a particular type of leverage, the changes to these parameters involves the assessment of trading fees. So something to keep in mind there. So now we can go ahead and define some of our fee payment variables that are used to calculate payouts for when users close or modify positions. So you can see I've got some of the variables that we would need to be keeping track of, such as the price difference between price at any given moment of time that you might be settling a position, and the price at which you opened your position. You've got your funding payment, you've got your borrow fee payment, and so once we've got these basic variables kind of defined, we can surmise equations used to calculate payouts for both traders and liquidity providers, and those are both shown. Payout for traders is shown at the top of this slide. Payout to LPs is shown at the bottom of this slide. Basically, payout to traders is equal to the payout to traders plus the payout to or from the delta neutrality fee is equal to size of traders collateral plus the notional size of position times change in price plus a funding payment minus a borrow fee payment. And then payout for LPs on their settlement would be equal to the collateral on the counter side of the trade minus the notional size of the position times change in price. So one of the big takeaways for this is you can see LP payout isn't affected by funding payments, which is defined as F here, and it's not affected by delta neutrality fees paid by traders as well. So now we're going to discuss what kind of causes these fee rates to change relative to user or market inputs. Now we're actually going to get into some of the math. This has mostly just been kind of setting the groundwork for what we're actually going to be doing when we're calculating what both instant and overtime fee payments will be. So we'll start with funding payments or funding rates. And for this, let's consider a situation where the net notional open interest is positive, meaning longs are more dominant. So we can determine short and long funding rates. As you can see here, the funding rates for longs are equal to the minimum value of net notional open interest divided by the total interest volume that then is multiplied by a funding rate sensitivity constant up to the arbitrary cap that we put in place, right? And funding rates for shorts are effectively equal to the funding rate for longs multiplied by the total long open interest divided by total short open interest. And this ensures a higher payout for traders who are taking the unpopular side of the trade. So if we wanted to look at the funding payment over a specified time period or any given time period T, it can be calculated as follows, where the fee that is assessed is equal to your funding rate, over this given time, multiplied by the average price of collateral over time t times the notional size of the position. And this is what we see right here in this simplified version of the equation. You have your funding rate multiplied by the average price of the collateral over time t multiplied by the notional size of your position. And therefore, if we wanted to determine max funding payment over any given time period, we can calculate it by taking max values for all the parameters that impact funding rates. So that would be max funding rate cap, the max price, which would either be your take profit or your liquidation price, because again, we're assuming we want to be well funded. Depending on whether the position is long or short, that's what your price max would be. You would need to know the full time interval, and then you would need to know the notional size of the position. So kind of in conclusion, funding rates change only when positions notional sizes change relative to net notional open interest. And these funding rates should scale linearly with net notional open interest. So let's go to the next set of fees, which are borrow fees. So borrow fee payments are impacted primarily by collateral locked up in the counter trade to your position, and the borrow fee rate at any given time. So we wanted to find the total uncapped borrow fee, which is what this equation is looking to calculate right here. You'd multiply the total collateral locked in a counter trade, which is represented by this GPOS variable, is the size of the collateral locked up on the counter side of your trade. Summarize all those at a given time, multiply that by the borrow fee rate. And borrow fees are bound by total collateral locked for a particular position. So you've got collateral locked both on the trader side and the counter trade side. So you're gonna sum these two amounts of collaterals, and that borrow fee is bound by this summed collateral amount and the maximum amount of fees that can be assessed. So effectively, your max borrow fees would be your max borrow fee cap times time period times the sum of both trader and counter trade collateral sum. And as we're about to see, changes in borrow fee rate is proportional to the difference between target utilization rate and the actual utilization rate in that block, which also results in linearly scaled fees. And just as like additional context, this locked collateral impacts utilization rates, and we'll go over that in just a second. So if we actually look at what impacts borrow fee rates, we can see there are two main contributors. You have your utilization rate, for which takes into account both current and target utilization rate expressed as this variable B, which is actually stands for bias, and a sensitivity constant, which is this KU variable, which is used to scale up and down fees relative to a particular utilization ratio. As you can see down here, utilization ratio is just calculated as the amount of locked LPs divided by the sum of locked and unlocked LPs. So how much is locked relative to the total amount of liquidity available. And the bias, that variable B of a particular market, is just the current utilization rate minus the target utilization rate. For modeling changes in borrow fees, you have to set a target utilization ratio. It's somewhat arbitrary, but a lot of perpetual swap exchanges target a utilization ratio of somewhere between 80 to 90%. So that's a decent value to use when calculating and modeling some of these changes in utilization rates. So borrow rates for any given new block can be determined by adding the borrow fee rate of the last block, which is defined as RC over this time period minus 1. So you're looking at the rate of the previous block plus the product of the utilization ratio, sensitivity constant, and the market bias. And this value for the borrow fees is, in quotes, clamped between 0 and whatever the max borrow fee is. We would not have a negative borrow fee, which is why the value is minimized at 0, and it is maximized at whatever we set our max borrow rate to. It's important to keep in mind that as the protocol, we want to encourage, or as protocol designers, we want to encourage migration of current utilization ratio closer to the target utilization ratio. And we can do this by incentivizing greater locked liquidity. So if the amount of locked liquidity is fairly low relative to the total amount of liquidity available, we can incentivize greater locking of that liquidity through some sort of incentivization scheme. We want to be able to reward liquidity providers for locking that liquidity so that traders can use it to open and close positions. And in return for this risk they are taking on by providing that locked liquidity that can be used to effectively lock in the counter trades for open positions, we would want them to receive a greater portion of fees. And how you split these fees is also somewhat arbitrary. There is risk reward trade-off here with fee splitting, but we'll save that for another discussion on risk management. Effectively, if you provide this incentivization scheme for liquidity providers to lock their liquidity for longer periods of time, you would have a portion of these fees distributed to locked LPs, and you can assess that by adding some sort of multiplier that is configurable per market. Ideally, you'd have a minimum value of 1, so that way, worst case scenario, locked liquidity receives the same amount of fees as unlocked liquidity, but ideally you have some sort of max value that's above that. Just arbitrarily, you could set it as 2. So locked liquidity could receive 2 times as much fees relative to unlocked liquidity. Just to recap on these fees, borrow fee payments are impacted primarily by collateral locked in counter trades and utilization rates. So as you're looking at how borrow fees change, you're really looking at it relative to the utilization ratio. So now we'll talk about the last fee that we want to model. And the last fee we want to model is the delta neutrality fee. This fee that's assessed to encourage the movement of the protocol towards a more balanced or delta neutral position overall. So the delta neutrality fee, which you can see in this equation, this clamp function is basically just saying, like, evaluate this variable from a particular minimum value and a maximum value. Anything under this minimum value is just assessed at min value. Anything over the max value is just assessed at the max value for the instant delta neutrality fee. So the delta neutrality fee is directly proportional to short, long, open interest imbalance, which is effectively, it is materialized for us in the form of this equation: n equals sum of positions times the notional size of those positions. So for determining these instant delta neutrality fees, really at any particular given time period t, or at any given time t, where current net notional open interest equals the sum of these positions multiplied by the notional size of each position, we can use the function here, which basically states that the delta neutrality fee at any given instant is equal to net open interest divided by this sensitivity parameter. between the positive and negative delta neutrality caps. This sensitivity constant that's used to calculate the delta neutrality fee is estimated based on price elasticity on the spot markets for your base asset. So just to give a little bit of context for this, the deeper the liquidity, the lower the delta neutrality fee needs to be, because that price elasticity is very low for high liquidity or for deep liquidity assets. So let's actually look at how this instant delta neutrality fee changes based on market and user input. So the total delta neutrality fee the total delta neutrality fee for a change in position would be delta neutrality fee for a position is equal to change in net notional open interest times the delta neutrality fee for that for a given net notional open interest. So in order to calculate a fee over time or over a changing net notional open interest, we need to be able to find out how this instant fee changes as net open interest changes from both the starting and finishing range of n, which we can do with some simple integrals. So in order to do this integral, you'll need to keep in mind the equation for the instant delta neutrality fee, which we discussed here. So basically n over ks. So to integrate it, we need to basically just consider where the clamping occurs. So we already said your min value is the negative value for your DNF cap, and your max value is the positive value for your DNF cap. So basically, if n over k, this function, is lower than the negative delta neutrality cap, then your fee is equal to that negative cap. If it's above the positive delta neutrality fee cap, then your delta neutrality fee is equal to that cap. And anywhere in between it, you're going to evaluate that function as its actual function, n over k. So we integrate each of these cases over a given integral. Take the integral of n over k, you get n squared over 2k, and then you assess that from n all the way up to n plus delta n. And in doing so, you end up with, this is the simplified integral of this. You can break it apart a little more, but this is just simplified for easy observation. And I want to just point out a few important things here. So if the fee, if the delta neutrality fee for a particular position is positive, that means that the delta neutrality fund, I mentioned that this fee is received and given out to traders from a particular fund. It can be a contract, wallet address. Ideally, it's something that is automated. But if this if your delta neutrality fee is positive, that means that the fund, the fee is charged from a trader. And in doing so, this operation brings your fundedness ratio, which is this capital F S, closer to 1. And if the delta neutrality fee of a particular position is negative, meaning that this fund is paying out to a particular trader, we're actually going to be incorporating the fundedness ratio, this function of the function of, or this ratio of the payout amounts for the fee divided by the total amount of funds available in the neutrality fund. We're actually going to be using that ratio in order to impact the fee that is assessed. So the reason we would want to do this, the reason we want to increase or decrease the this delta neutrality fee based on fundedness is that the neutrality fund is able to effectively reset each time you go from like your net notional open interest changes from a positive to a negative value, right? So if your net notional open interest is positive, it means that longs are predominant. If your net notional open interest is negative, that means shorts are predominant. So every time you have a change in predominant position overall within the protocol or within a particular market, this delta neutrality fund should be able to reset. So it basically would mean that there is zero funds in this wallet, in the smart contract to be distributed or received from traders, meaning that the protocol is effectively delta neutral. And so there's some points that could be made here about like depending on the type of margin collateral that you're providing, it could change the fundedness ratio. But I'm not going to get too much into that. If you're interested in this, feel free to message me afterwards, and I'll go into that. But it's a little bit more of a complicated logic to follow. So I'm not going to spend any time on this, like the difference between how these fees are assessed based on like whether it's a crypto denominated market or a stablecoin denominated market. Yeah, so briefly covered the three main fee payments. And I briefly touched on trading fees too. Trading fees are a little bit are much more basic relative to your borrowing, funding, and DNF rates. And we touched on how these different fee payment rates change relative to user and market input. And to wrap this all up, I want to very briefly talk about how these fees impact liquidations and somewhat by extension, risk management for the protocol. So for a perpetual swap exchange to maintain its, in quotes, well-fundedness, all potential fees incurred by a user. So this is why we were talking about like what is the max borrow fee that a user might pay? What is the max DNF fee a user might pay? What is the max funding rate someone might pay? All the potential fees incurred by a user are part of the liquidation margin that is required. So this is collateral that's required to keep a position open, which is impacted by your base asset price, and it's also impacted by the combination of your notional position size, your leverage. So that generally sets what most people think of your liquidation price would be, your notional position size and your leverage. However, in that amount of margin that's required or collateral required to keep margin at a particular point, we also are going to want to go ahead and incorporate those max fees. That way, in a worst case scenario, the protocol is able to stay well funded. And so just wanted to point out that all potential fees incurred by a user are part of the liquidation margin. It's I think this is generally a really good safety parameter. That way, worst case scenario, you assume that a user is going to need more collateral than is necessary, and they ended up getting charged less fees as a result. And it's easier to handle less fees than more fees, and the protocol ends up being in a position where it's no longer well funded. So lastly, I want to briefly touch on some risk reduction topics through modeling. Effectively, I want to highlight how these base mechanisms and functions can be optimized through simulations. So risk reduction and parameter tuning can be greatly improved through modeling of a wide range of market conditions, including changes in price, user activity, and they can also be greatly improved through market research. So looking at how other perpetual swap exchanges, how they tune their parameters, how they tune some of their variables, how they set some of their arbitrary thresholds for the amount of risk that the protocol is willing to take, the amount of risk that traders are willing to take, the amount of risk that liquidity providers are willing to take on. These things can all be greatly tuned by just doing extensive simulation and modeling with changing prices, user activity. That user activity translates to differences in utilization ratios, like difference in utilization ratios, difference in net notional open interest, differences or changes in notional position size. All of these things are important for simulating user activity. And there are some really good simulations out there that can do this. You kind of set your parameter, like Monte Carlo simulations are decent at simulating a variety of different variables for all these parameters and seeing the likelihood of these over time. And that coupled with greater market and competitor research, you can fine tune those a little bit better. Something else to keep in mind, constants such as all the sensitivity constants that we mentioned for these various fee rates can be changed to increase or decrease the sensitivity of the change in the parameters value relative to its correlated variables. So if you want there to be a greater response elicited from a change in this correlated variable, you could increase the sensitivity of that constant. But again, it's important to model all these things to see, like, all right, as the sensitivity is cranked up, how does that impact all of these other parameters? There are also somewhat arbitrary parameters such as your max fees and your max rate caps that can be changed, again, to elicit quicker market reactions to protocol imbalances, but you do risk greater deviation from being well-funded. So there is a risk to reward trade-off, and I'm not going to go into this this particular topic, this ability to elicit quicker market responses. We'll cover that later this week on Friday. We're actually going to be talking about risk management and DeFi, and modeling some of these things is going to be part of that risk management process. But it's also important to keep in mind that while fee rates can change, markets will continue to determine risk premium associated with deviation from target utilization. This is a result of markets finding their own equilibrium for risk in relation to locked collateral from traders and countersides of trades. And again, I'm not going to go into all of the risks that both traders and liquidity providers incur or could potentially incur right now. But it's important to keep in mind that markets effectively are determining this risk premium, and if we want to alter that risk premium by doing a variety of different tweaking, we just have to understand the risk on the other side of that. Like how does that impact well-fundedness? And one more other thing to keep in mind is the latency for rate parameter updates. The greater the latency for these updates, the greater the, in quotes, jerk reaction by market participants will be upon normalization. Something you can kind of think about that, some people listening right now or listening afterwards might remember this, but a good example of this would actually be how the Silk Peg, Silk being the private stablecoin that is built by Shade Protocol, how the Silk Peg peg price adjusts to change or to like staleness of that peg price data. And they do this by introducing this smoothing concept. So there is no massive jerk from the peg price. So this is something that protocols existing and new should really look at, like mechanisms to reduce that jerk reaction by market participants. And yeah, while we didn't talk about mechanisms used to actually update these variables that determine rates, we'll briefly talk about it at the end of the week on Friday when we're talking about risk management. It is important to keep in mind that you want to minimize disruptions to protocol updates. You want the changes in these fees to be as smooth as possible. Just like, when you're looking at integrals, or you're looking at area under a curve, generally you wanting to try and make that curve as smooth as possible. You have these big jerks in areas under the curve at particular points. You increase it will elicit a more jerky response by market participants as a result. So, and then one last thing. This is for anyone building risk frameworks for our protocol, whether it be risk framework for any leverage protocol. It doesn't necessarily have to be a leverage like a perpetual swap exchange. This can be applicable for money markets, but it's important that designers of risk frameworks assess both qualitative and quantitative risks before introducing any new markets into the exchange. That the qualitative assessment in particular helps put a value on the risk premium that's attached to unpriced externalities, and that's one of the things that liquidity providers are generally really taking into account when they're assessing, like, what sort of risk premium must I have in order to actually take this opportunity up. And so with that, I've shared all that I've prepared for this particular workshop. I know this was focused mostly on the mathematical and logical modeling for well-funded performant perpetual swaps. I didn't cover any of the actual implementation of this math and the implementation of the logic and the actual smart contracts. That will be up to you guys. However, we have multiple secret smart contract developers, seasoned secret smart contract developers who are available as mentors to answer any of these questions you might have about how to use mathematical operations using Cosmosm or any other pertinent technical details that are relating to the implementation of these fee structures. So just want to say thank you all for listening.